Welcome. Welcome to the R.K. Teetzel Lecture in Architecture for 2025 here at the Paul Cadario Conference Center. My name is Sally Tagliamonte, and I am the acting principal of University College. I'm also a professor of linguistics and a Canada Research Chair in Language Variation and Change. Let us come together with intellectual curiosity, openness to new ideas, and a common goal to learn more about Professor Akcan's research. The lecture tonight will bring together expertise in archaeology and explore the role that architecture has in healing societies after conflict and disaster. She will focus on spaces and buildings and introduce us to the idea that their design can contribute to reparation and has the potential for meaningful restitution. For the UC community, this line of argumentation, I suspect, will resonate for all of us because, as we know, this UC building has had a major impact on our own sensibilities throughout its history, including the significant fact that it burnt down in a flaming spectacle back in 1890. And then, with great fanfare across the community of Toronto, was restored. Ever since and to this day, our members have expressed what has been referred to as, and I quote, a lodestone of affection for the building and our community as a great good place. I'm quoting from the book, Not an Unsightly Building. But before we hear about architecture and its impact on the human sentiment, I would like to ground us in space and in time. So let us come back to the earth under our feet. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home for many Indigenous people from across North and Central America, a territory known as Turtle Island. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. With an Indigenous perspective, let us take a moment to reflect on the impact of Indigenous heritage of the place where we live and work, and how the new structures on this land might be conceived as bringing a new way to understand architecture's role in our own social and environmental justice. This Teetzel lecture was established by Rita Kathleen Teetzel, who graduated from University College in 1912. She requested that a portion of her estate be used to further the study of art and architecture at University College by bringing distinguished lecturers to talk to us about their research in these areas. In this regard, we are extremely honored to have Professor Esra Akcan here with us. Professor Akcan's a professor and director of graduate studies in the Department of Architecture and a board member at the Institute for Comparative Modernities at Cornell University. Before we introduce Professor Akcan from a disciplinary perspective, I would like to give you some quick housekeeping notes. Those of you who are in the room tonight, a microphone will be passed around during the Q&A period. Please raise your hand high to ask the question once the lecture concludes. Speak into the microphone rather than speaking without one so that our audience at home can hear your questions. For those attending virtually, live closed captioning is available for this event. The option can be turned on by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please use the Zoom chat function to submit your online questions. We have Amin Ahmed, our virtual facilitator, at the back of the room this evening, and he will be reading the questions that come through from the Zoom room. I now call upon our lecturer's convener, Professor Claire Zimmerman from the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape, and Design, to introduce our distinguished speaker from a disciplinary perspective. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you, Sally, and good evening, and thank you for the land acknowledgement. It's Well, it's a tremendous pleasure to introduce Professor Esra Akcan of Cornell University. I first met Esra when we were both PhD students some few years ago. The scene that Esra and I entered at that time seemed to have a particular charge for young historians, particularly architectural historians. Our cohort was tasked, our general large cohort, was tasked with doing better historical work on a basic empirical level, and particularly in regards to understudied and under-resourced topics. We were tasked also with producing better theory, incorporating developments from comparative literature, post-colonial studies, linguistics, anthropology, etc., into architecture. And finally, we needed better critical work in which the relationship between architecture and late industrial society might be recast for the benefit of both. These ambitions for better history, better theory, and better criticism were to shine light on the past and reflect on the present, from our perspectives as former designers as well as contemporary critical historians. That was the project as I understood it then and reflect back on it now, when we were training. It is then no surprise that this general opening up of the discipline that I just described resulted in Esra Akcan's 2018 book, Open Architecture, which to me represents the maturation of that project of better history, better theory, and better criticism. In this and her other work, Esra stands out for her compelling, steadfast, and committed work. I would describe her as a scholar who takes no prisoners in the analysis of architecture as an agent in complex human relations for which the field often seeks to take neither credit nor blame. Rather than enumerating the astonishing range of Esra's achievements, this would be both fun and easy to do, as she has won practically every fellowship there is to win in our field, from the Getty Research Institute to the Clark Art Institute to the Wissenschaftskolleg Berlin. I focus here on her published work, specifically her books. Akcan's research foregrounds the intertwined architectural and urban histories of Europe, West Asia, and Northeast Africa, offering new ways to understand architecture's role in global social and environmental justice. Her book, Architecture in Translation, Germany, Turkey, and the Modern House, from Duke in 2012, extended the notion of translation beyond language to visual fields in what is regarded as a landmark work in our field. Turkey, Modern Architectures in History, 2012, with Sibel Bozdoğan, is the first volume in any language to cover the entire 20th century of history of architecture in Turkey. Open Architecture, Migration, Citizenship, and the Urban Renewal of Berlin-Kreuzberg by Iba, 1984-1987, I've already mentioned, 2018, defines open architecture as the translation of a new ethic of hospitality into design process, using the urban renewal of Berlin's immigrant neighborhood and giving voice not only to the established and understudied architects who were invited to build public housing in that project, but also to non-citizen residents who provided first-person testimony about living in these buildings. Her book, Abolish Human Bans, Intertwined Histories of Architecture, from the Canadian Centre of Architecture in 2022, builds on her theory of architectural translation to construct an activist gesture against the racist anti-immigration policies of ruling powers, strangely prescient for 2025. She has co-edited Art and Architecture of Migration and Discrimination with Iftikhar Dadi. Her book, Right to Heal, Resettler Nationalism and Architecture After Conflicts and Disasters, has just come out, or is just coming out, and she's going to tell us about it tonight. In it, she explores architecture's role in healing societies after conflicts and disasters by discussing buildings and spaces in relation to transitional justice and energy transition. Her next project is a book with the working title, A History of the World Made by Modern Architecture, which will fill a basic need for architectural history and education, a global history of nominally Euro-American concepts, modern architecture, international style, that encountered the resistance and recalibrations of the rest of the globe over 2.5 centuries of encounters. Please join me in welcoming Professor Esra Akcan to University College as the 2025 Teetzel Lecture in Architecture.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. It was so wonderful, and thank you all for being here. Can you hear me? Well, so I would also like to thank the historian team of the Department of Architecture who have been so wonderful hosts so far, Claire, Marilou, Alexander, Peter, Jason, and so on. And I heard that my nomination involved a big committee and a long procedure, so I'm really honored to be nominated to give this lecture. And I would also, of course, like to thank Marcus, Sally, and of course, Abigail. She's timekeeping somewhere, who organized everything so exquisitely. As Claire said, I will present my book that is forthcoming from Duke University Press in a few months. It's called Architecture and Right to Heal. The press changed the title a little bit. So I will start this lecture with my starting point for the book years ago. While working on the manuscript, I frequently came back to the premise that started this research. To insist on imagining the future is sometimes the only resistance against the destructive powers in times of crisis. How reversible is damage due to state or social violence? How does a post-disaster society restore itself? As professions of futurity, architecture and planning are involved in healing, but they have also been historically responsible for building a world where most of the human population lives in unjust and disaster-prone environments. I therefore decided to write a book that critically examines the causes of disasters, but at the same time demonstrates architecture's potential for a meaningful and reckoning and repair. So architecture can be both an offender and a healer in conflicts and disasters. While I could not have predicted it when I started this research, a pandemic, an earthquake, several floods, 3 wars, and 2 famines took place during the time that I worked on the book, on the lands that it covers. Today is the anniversary of the earthquake that hit Turkey and Syria in February 2023. After this earthquake, I kept being haunted by a self-made video that circulated on social media. It showed a family trapped in a claustrophobic alcove of a collapsed building who sent love to their friends outside, inhaling toxic dust, unable to move, next to their lifeless child that they did not include in the camera's frame to spare us from seeing the deceased body. Less than a year later, the voices and images of those trapped in Gaza shook the world, as well as our campuses. As I was writing, I read the news about the destruction of Sudan, including the buildings in Khartoum that are portrayed in this book and that I had visited a couple years earlier. A climate disaster has become regular in the news. We feel not only pain, but also collective guilt and anger coming face to face with such first-person accounts, because deep down, we know that many conflicts and disasters could have been prevented through better planning and architecture, not to mention better governments and policies. So the book explores architecture's role in healing by discussing buildings and spaces in relation to transitional justice and energy transition. It locates spaces of political and ecological harm and makes a call to repurpose them as healing places where violence and violations are confronted and accountability and reparations are instituted. There's considerable literature on the reconstruction of cities after international wars, but this book discusses transitions after internal, social, state, or business-led aggressions. There are ample journalistic essays that report on state violence and climate change, but this book demonstrates that these issues may be addressed in a more extensive and layered spectrum through architectural history. The chapters substantiate the argument that the seemingly singular and isolated shocks have deep roots in history. They reveal ideas that create a loop of repetition between disaster and manipulations in the name of healing. The forward momentum of the narrative is attained with chapters proceeding from individual healing to communal and then to planetary healing by upscaling, so to speak, from an individual to a village, a city, the world, and the earth. Connected to each other conceptually and episodically, each chapter discusses a distinct type of conflict or disaster, but they also reveal connections and incompletions that lead to the conclusion that right to heal means understanding the intersections between social, global, and environmental justice. Each type of conflict and disaster calls for a discussion of related architectural programs. Housing, for instance, is implicated in healing after mass displacement and earthquakes. Memorials matter for repairing from state violence. Master plans and campuses are implicated in climate disasters. Gardens, parks, and ruderal landscapes matter for preventing the loss of biodiversity. A chain of conflicts and disasters that extend to the entire book shows that a mother's right to mourn is also a society's right to heal from state violence. A village community's right to heal from enforced migration also involves struggle against xenophobia and violent transgressions of international law. A city's struggle to recover from civil wars and deadly earthquakes is the same struggle to avoid economic crashes. A country's right to feed its population is also its right to heal from colonization and environmental extraction. Its right to heal from global war is also the world's right to recover from global warming. And the planet Earth's species' right to live is also the nation's struggle to live together. This structure is a demonstration that one cannot confront climate change and mass extinction, harms against nature, without understanding harms against peoples and communities. So healing is used as an umbrella term in this book, which encompasses but differs from repair, restoration, reparation, or restitution. As distinct from mechanistic metaphors such as repair, healing refers to the improvement of organisms, human and more than human. It takes place not only due to the actions of responsible institutions, but also through self-improvement. Healing does not always involve repair or restoration. It sometimes means choosing not to repair. And healing builds on but differs from the financial aspects of reparations as well. There's a recent momentum in the world to reckon with the injustices of the past, including those of military regimes, apartheid, civil wars, colonialism, and slavery. The term reparations originally referred to monetary compensations paid to countries after wars. But recent discussions call for broadening this nomenclature of diplomacy and law and searching for ways to implement not only material compensations like money, but also non-material restitutions. As Ta-Nehisi Coates, who brought new momentum to Black reparations, says, one cannot close an achievement gap without closing an injury gap. So this book responds to this call for finding more ways to bring a society to a confrontation with the lack of accountability for the political and ecological harms of the past. In this sense, healing means justice achieved retroactively. I suggest the word right to heal in order to acknowledge healing as a human and species right, and to advocate for the expansion of human rights and the implementation of more than human species rights. In other words, healing from conflicts and disasters is contingent on the local and international movements that expand human and species rights. And I don't have time now, but I should say in a parenthesis that I do not use the word human, human rights, or justice lightly or monolithically. I participate in the ongoing recovery from the totalizing definitions of these words. But giving a name to a conflict or a disaster as a matter of human rights is the prerequisite of healing. A mother may mourn in isolation over her child who never returned from state custody due to police violence, but it is only when this trauma is named as enforced disappearance that it can be identified as a human rights violation, gain public visibility, and become a social movement. Enforced disappearance was recognized as a human rights violation only in 2006, after the past abuses came to the forefront of human rights movements with the grassroots process such as the one in Argentina starting in 1977. It is still not ratified by many countries, the ones that you see in orange here. But with this process, transitional justice entered the lexicon of international law as a comprehensive and retroactive mechanism towards peace. Only by recognizing individual incidents as connected to human rights issue, we can appreciate the role of architectural programs as zones of struggle against violations in the past and demands for reparations today. Spaces such as urban squares are not simply demonstration sites, but they're also symbolic cemeteries of disappeared bodies, and informal right to truth commissions, where facts about historical atrocities are revealed. Only then we can see architectural programs such as cemeteries and disappearing graves as lands that are weaponized by the nation-state apparatus for the physical, economic, or ideological victory of one group over the other. Or programs such as transitional justice memorials as sites of healing from state violence when their locations, forms, narratives, and participants align, and when they're not erected for revenge, instrumentalization of victimhood, or ranking of suffering. Or chapter 2, a community may be deported from one land and resettled in another, but it's only when this forced migration is named as partition that its perpetrators can be identified as national leaders and diplomats of international institutions. A society may conceive an earthquake or a famine as God's will, but it's only when this building failure or food insecurity is named as human-made, urban, or climate disaster that one can identify its root causes and see it as injustice rather than misfortune. All of us can mourn about the extinction of a charismatic animal, but it's only when international institutions and nation states recognize and ratify the rights of nature and the rights of non-human species that we might reverse the alarming rates of mass extinction. So while Right to Heal reflects the conceptual ambitions, the book's historical contribution foregrounds the transition of the Ottoman Empire into post-imperial national orders after European colonization throughout the 20th century. Part of my reason to choose this focus was my dissatisfaction with the formulaic global history of recent years, which has created a simplified narrative about colonization and decolonization of the world, based mostly on the history of British, French, and Spanish colonization. While correcting earlier accounts and exposing the relations between modernity and coloniality, this history excludes large sections of the globe. It ignores the differences between what came before, and it trivializes the political and ecological harms of modernity's other dark sides, such as national partitions, religious divides, and ethnocentrism. So my overarching story, told through shorter episodes, is the aftermath of the long dissolution of the Ottoman Sultanate, when culturally and religiously mixed populations were divided during the making of the modern world order. For instance, Al-Idrisi's world map of the year 1154 famously depicted the continents we call Africa, Asia, and Europe as one continuous and connected landmass. I will turn this map upside down to illustrate my point. In the 19th century, the Ottoman Sultanate still extended to parts of these three continents as one entity, before they were perceived divided in the 20th century. So this history at the intersection of Afro-Eurasia demonstrates that modernity partitioned this land into three continents and built physical and imaginative borders between and within them. I have chosen some of the British Empire's post-Ottoman interests to understand this untold history. Colonies and mandates in today's Cyprus, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Palestine, and Sudan, and targets of intervention such as Greece, Turkey, and the Balkans provide examples. Racist constructs of European Orientalism and extractive economies of industrial capitalism on the one hand, and the racist and classist tensions among the Muslims and non-Muslims of the Ottoman Sultanate on the other hand, these two forces converged with major consequences on the built environment. And I offer the term resettler nationalism as a concept with more explanatory power than existing words used in established history or popular media. Much like settler colonialism, resettler nationalism relies on the mass migration of peoples and causes forced dislocations and dispossessions. However, unlike histories that cast nationalism purely as an anti-colonial idea, this book demonstrates the wounds of resettler nationalism. By resettler nationalism, I refer to the double ideology of the religious rift and the national fault line, which stirred race-based nationalist and religious sentiments, escalated ethnic violence, and eventually caused mass dispossessions. The long dissolution of the Ottoman Sultanate triggered countless mandatory population movements at the geometric center of Afro-Eurasia. This map, for instance, shows the forced displacement of 5 million Muslims and about 2 million Christians between Ottoman and neighboring lands. These population movements significantly altered the cultural, social, and built environments of the lands of departure and arrival. They turned the Ottoman states into an empire of refugees, as Vladimir Hemet coined the term, and many parts of the empire into refugee countries. And these diplomatically arranged forced migrations continued well into the 20th century that I discuss in the book. This is the list, and actually are still ongoing. Just a few days ago, Trump suggested a similar thing for Gaza. So this process caused ethnic and religious homogenization of the Ottoman successor states. For instance, due to the Greek-Turkish population exchange administered by the United Nations forerunner, League of Nations, some towns in today's Greece dropped from 70% Muslim population to 0% and vice versa. Even though there was a myriad of communities in villages and towns speaking and writing in an uncounted number of languages with multiple denominations and cultural expressions, they were divided into two polarized categories and forcibly sent to villages and towns on the other side of the sea, where they did not speak the language or know the ways. This 1923 exchange of populations between Europe and Asia was in effect the irreversible partition of Christians and Muslims into two separate continents, and it was arguably modeled on the ideas of the British imperialists in India, and it served as an international treaty model for the United Nations partition of India and Pakistan, as well as the partition plan of Palestine 14 years later. By today, this 1923 partition line has evolved into the border between European Union and non-EU countries, the border where refugees are being agglomerated, risking their lives to cross and dying on the way. This partition line became one of the borders of the global apartheid, as Catherine Besseman coined the term, while defining the worldwide mechanisms with which countries of the West or the global North control the mobility and labor of people from elsewhere. So my book shows that these diplomatically supported compulsory population transfers and forced mass migrations that continued in all directions have created urban debris that are still visible and sometimes still in need of healing. For instance, I look at the afterlife of buildings and entire villages that were completely abandoned despite being located in striking landscapes. Or I write the urban history of modern Athens and modern Istanbul as refugee arrival cities. I look at an Istanbul district, which was the arrival space of both Balkan refugees from Greece, Bulgaria, and former Yugoslavia, and Uyghur, Kazakh, Azeri, and other Central Asian refugees from China and the former Soviet Union. This refugee settlement transformed into slum developments as a reflection of capitalist urbanization, and then these illegal houses transformed into legal but earthquake-vulnerable buildings as a result of the government's negligence while it was advancing ethno-religious cultural agendas. So due to these forced migrations and population swaps, the age of coexistence on these lands, Osama Magdisi's term, was replaced with what I call the age of resettler nationalism. The established history wrote many of these events as the final evidence of modern nation-states' inevitability, assuming that mixed religions and languages in multicultural Ottoman societies would unavoidably break into pieces. And instead of tracing the precise history of the emergence of ethnic conflict, atrocities against civilians and forced migrations were normalized, even glorified, as the unavoidable human cost in the name of nationalism. Genocide ethnic cleansing, and demographic engineering was cast as a struggle against guerrilla warfare or against invasion. But my research led me to another conclusion about the perpetrators and victims of this history. Rather than taking sides with either the national or religious official historiography, I try to speak politically outside the polar narratives by writing what I call the people's history of architecture under resettler nationalism. One of the major intentions of this book is to write the architectural history of conflicts and disasters from the viewpoint of its victims, and devise mechanisms to do so in the absence of conventional documents. The book tells the history of nation formation by focusing on the architectural spaces, photographs, and belongings of the expelled communities, and quotes extensively from the memoirs of refugees and exchanged migrants. Researching this people's history of architecture exposed a big contrast between the declarations of state agents and the experiences of those involved in the examples that I looked at. Hearing the migrants' voices, I came to characterize the history of partitions as a trauma imposed on these lands. Against the official historiographies of nation states that identify partitions as tough but necessary solutions to ethnic conflict, aided by state-sponsored architecture, this book writes partitions' architectural history from the ground. And this has led me to a reconceptualization of partition as the rift between the rulers and the peoples, and not the rift between the two communities, two polarized communities. These international and state-sponsored partitions did not heal the ethnic conflicts as they claimed. Not to trivialize the immense challenge of settling millions, but I concluded that the authorities understood land as an ethno-religious category. They treated land settlement as a top-down demographic engineering device, and its architecture as a technical problem in a post-disaster setting, failing to notice the trauma of enforced mass population displacement and refusing to confront the cultural complexity of their task. For instance, after the Greek-Turkish population exchange, the standardized and typified housing units placed in equally homogenized grid settlement plans were meant to serve the Turkification and Hellenization policies of their respective governments. Both countries drew from the debate over standardization and industrialization that was becoming a totalizing global phenomenon at the time. As a result, ironically, housing in both countries were almost the same with each other, regardless of the climatic or historical differences, and despite the fact that their residents had been partitioned due to their religious and assumed races. So peoples were separated and dispossessed because of a conviction about the untranslatability of their cultures into each other, and then they were moved into standardized houses that were exactly the same with one another. So it is within this paradigmatic crisis of modernity that my book finds exceptions and foregrounds those architects and space makers who were motivated by the right to heal. The history from below guided me to a transformative depolarization and to designers whose practices I interpret as moving towards solidarity and towards a cosmopolitan ethics. So for the rest of my talk today, I decided to focus on the chapter on climate disasters. The division of the global ecosystem into nation states is ecocidal. Franz Broswimmer rightly warned against the harms of nationalism on the environment. The final two chapters suggest that the process set in motion by resettler nationalism is also one of the root causes of climate disasters. To discuss architecture's role, I distinguish between climate determinism that perpetuates hierarchies, as opposed to climate consciousness for the sake of sustainable architectural practice, and climate depth for the sake of reparations. Climate determinism frames humans in essential identity categories according to the climates of the lands that they come from. In other words, climate here acts as a proxy for race and nation. Whereas climate consciousness means envisioning a justice and planetary healing that would arise if climate is duly employed in professions such as architecture. And climate reparations aspires for a just energy transition by giving dues, reparations to those who have been subjugated because of climate determinism in the past. One may misleadingly infer from the data on the built environment's responsibility in causing climate change that architects have not paid attention to climate. To the contrary, however, there's hardly any other criterion as ordinary and as omnipresent as climate in architectural design. From Vitruvius to guidebooks of corporate environmentalism, references to environmental regulation, and considerations of the sun, the wind, the heat, the cold, the rain, the snow, these have been regular inputs for designers of buildings around the world. So the challenge today, if we want to evaluate architecture's role in climate change, is to write not only the history of architecture with respect to climate, but also to the history of climate due to architecture. Not only climate in architectural history, but also architecture in climate's history, in climate change. And established historians of architecture have provided a large spectrum of definitions for climate, ranging from a criterion to be controlled to one that inspires difference. My book contributes to this scholarship, but takes issues when there's soft antagonism towards climatic modernism's complicity with colonialism and resettler nationalism. On the one hand, I demonstrate how climate served as a proxy for nation and race for much of the modern and colonial period. On the other hand, I foreground examples from understudied lands where low-carbon architectural practices served as climate adaptation techniques before fossil fuel-dependent technologies took over. And let me bring some evidentiary support to this. Khartoum, in today's Sudan, and the cotton plantations in its countryside is a thought-provoking example. The fact that architecture in Sudan features neither in the books about British colonization or Ottoman architecture, nor African architecture or Islamic architecture, is a testimony to the weakness of categories we use today as a result of resettler nationalism. Sudan's climate disasters and architectural attempts to prevent them fittingly demonstrate the distinction between climate determinism and climate consciousness. And let's start with the sun. The perceived benefits of the sun for architecture changed over time, especially during the transition from colonial to post-colonial eras. Quote, "It has been shown that the greatest enemy of the white man in the tropics is the sun," MacLean said as a town planner of British Sudan and Palestine, summarizing a very common perception at the time. British architects and residents were actually on a mission to block the sun during their settlement in Sudan, in Khartoum. When one compares the colonial climatization of the early 20th century with the advocacy of solar energy today, one would indeed be surprised of the relative standing of the sun and how it was the enemy in the early 20th century. So climate determinism significantly shaped master plans and architectural types. Upon conquest in 1898, the British general Herbert Kitchener laid a plan of Khartoum on the fortress Ottoman town, demolishing most of the existing urban fabric. Even though the Ottoman plans marked the threat of floods and refrained from settling to the west of the city along the White Nile, Kitchener's plan neglected this climate wisdom and extended the same gridded street layout to the flooding zones. In 1912, MacLean extended this master plan, explaining the colonial grid as a military invention that posited the British Empire as the inheritor of Roman Empire. To justify his ambitions, MacLean and his successor, Governor Sarsfield Hall, relied on the typical Orientalist accounts of travelers of the 1850s and 60s, and they described the Ottoman Khartoum as miserable, filthy, unhealthy, primitive, and so on and so forth, to justify the implementation of the grid plan as a means for proper sanitation and climatization. These exact words soon triggered into the official history of Khartoum in an all too common way that assumed the colonial architects as carriers of civilization. And a related theme was tropical planning and architecture, and expertise with colonial origins, but one that still makes an impact. At the time, planners and architects too often looked up to the traveler Samuel Baker's opinions on Ottoman lands that industrial civilization and progress depended on moderate climate. The wide and straight avenues of the new Khartoum were promoted for the free circulation of air and breeze in a tropical climate. MacLean expressed the need for proficiency in tropical architecture in order to protect the British citizens from the hostile climate, whom he differentiated from the natives due to their skin color, and justified this difference with the alleged racial adaptedness to climatic conditions. So MacLean thus proposed, quote, as a general rule, it is well, if possible, to segregate the white and native population so that Europeans live in houses so arranged as to be exposed to the prevailing winds, surrounded by gardens and open spaces. The colonial planning decisions resulted in an over-expansive city due to the low density of housing zones to be ventilated in green areas and due to the distances between large-sized urban blocks. And here is where this familiar established history gets complicated when one looks at Ottoman succession. MacLean had the British colonial settlers in mind when he diagnosed the Sun as their enemy. But the term native, which he categorically differentiated from the white, had indeed been very convoluted in Ottoman Khartoum. This reflected another layer of ignorance about the city that had been composed of multi-religious and multicultural population, including Ottoman Greeks, Egyptian Hawas, Cypriots, Yemeni, Syrians, Armenian, West African migrants, and so on. When municipal officers proceeded to implement the master plan, they discovered that many communities did not fit into the flattened categories. Even then, they never truly confronted the conceptual challenges that the diversity on the ground should have provided. As a result, they invented new demographic categories to calibrate their Orientalist and color-based biases with the census statistics, such as, I'm quoting, better class natives, native laboring classes, non-African natives, non-European foreigners, and so on, all of which appeared arbitrarily in official documents and master plans that implemented social hierarchies and forcibly moved some communities to segregate the city neatly. The separation of Khartoum into zones identified according to the British categories of race under Ottoman Sultanate is a perfect demonstration of resettler nationalism. Khartoum's master plan was a harbinger of the modern world order that relied on the perceived necessity to unmix peoples. The borders that divided the colonial city with a few racial categories would be mapped onto the planet's territory as borders of the divided nations. Eventually, the British officers' conviction about the necessity of wide, straight boulevards on a grid due to their perceived climatic reasons to provide thermal comfort for the Europeans created a striking contrast between the urban fabric of Khartoum and Omdurman on the two banks of the river. But despite the centrality of climate as the main criterion, the planners actually ignored the most important weather events of Khartoum. Heavy rains flooded some areas and made streets unusable. Frequent haboob, or sandstorms, created piles of dust and sand that overwhelmed practically every building. In 1910, the Iraqi-born Ottoman traveler Mohammed Mihri had described Sudan storms as winds strong enough to blow stones into the air and knock down the trees and boats on the Nile, and as weather events that appeared at the horizon as giant red and black clouds piled on each other, which approached to hit one's face like fire and make one feel suffocated. Or C.A. Lee did not fail to notice that the dust and the sand dunes that buried the houses after the haboob of 1935, which had to be removed by manual labor. Many photographed the day after haboob show piles of sand formed mountains as high as the houses. Or in photographs of 1938, for instance, Civil Secretary James Gillian stands on the high ground as he oversees the native workers removing and loading the drift sand into railway wagons. The diaries of British professionals who became more and more skeptical of their government's decisions confirmed that the sandstorms continued to terrorize the city. To quote from Mary Kulvik's letter, "The mess in the house after such a sandstorm has to be seen to be believed. Even with windows shut, it gets in at doors and windows. First of all, the dust, inches deep, then the rain, to turn it into all mud." As a matter of fact, the already challenging impact of a sandstorm was aggrandized due to the colonial city plan. The large straight avenues, deceptively designed to capture the breeze for the sake of white man's thermal comfort, did not help during the frequent sandstorms. To this day, Khartoum residents mention dust as the most significant problem that they face in their houses. So moreover, Kitchener's military grid was extended to the cotton plantations in Khartoum's southern countryside. The Jazeera scheme is one of the largest irrigation projects in the world that opened canals between the two Nile rivers to maximize fertile soil and use the slope for water's course in canals. With the Jazeera scheme, the British Empire turned millions of acres inhabited by farmers, traders, nomads, and pilgrims into the world's largest irrigation project dedicated to the production of cotton. With Kitchener's orders, and just a year after Maclean's master plan, the district officers started the Jazeera scheme following the famine of 1913. Architectural order was recruited for the symbolic success of these cotton plantations. Aerial photos captures miles and miles of land divided into perfect rectangles with perfect linear lines, much like the logic of the grid that Kitchener and Maclean fancied to be a follower of Roman Empire. The photos occasionally capture small villages that timidly punctuate the strict geometry of the vast cotton fields with low-rise houses. This was where the laborers of the cotton fields slept at night and where their children received basic education in crowded schools. In stark contrast to the houses of the British cotton inspectors of the London-based Sudan Plantation Syndicate, who lived in these research farms and in large houses. Camels and light rails carried sacks of cotton from the fields to the agglomeration centers. These bales of cotton sacks amounted to sturdy structures as high as 3- or 4-story buildings in the middle of the flat landscape. The Jazeera plantations did not deliver its healing promises to the local population. The people of Sudan have experienced the highest number of droughts and famines in the history of the world. How come, you might ask, this land is subject to such a recurrent and continuing disaster, especially being placed between the two Nile rivers and on the world's largest irrigation infrastructure? How do climate disasters and geopolitical conflicts cause and fuel each other? The Jazeera scheme's director, Arthur Gaitskell, blamed famine, disease, warfare, arbitrary seizure of surplus as reasons that had discouraged productivity in the region before him. He thought that the Jazeera scheme was meant to change the state of affairs. However, rather than crops to feed the population and prevent the next famine, the British officers used this infrastructure to grow cotton. Given the active world market of cotton and because of its use in the industry, cotton was deemed more lucrative. As anthropologist Victoria Bernal revealed, the colonial rule threatened farmers with eviction if they failed to produce cotton or disobeyed the protocols of the new agrarian system. The Jazeera scheme was yet another engine in the empire of cotton, to use Sven Becker's word. While Sudan was one of the first places in history to grow cotton, the rise of the European domination in the cotton industry became the main locomotive of global industrial capitalism. Countries waged wars to access the fertile lands, and powerful industrialists made use of colonial expansion and slave labor to produce cotton. Additionally, the Jazeera scheme is also a perfect case in point for the creation of a bio-monoculture during this time, whose slow violence in causing climate disaster and mass extinction is being realized today. When the Ottoman traveler Muhammad Mihri visited Sudan in 1910, he had chronicled a long list of crops, in addition to cotton, including all sorts of vegetables that you see on the screen listed. But after the implementation of the Jazeera irrigation canals, almost all were replaced with cotton. Sorry, the line is cutting, but it says cotton. It writes cotton there. So famine is usually perceived as a lack of development and modernity, and summons conventional humanitarian responses and modern technical solutions. But as Jenny Atkins has argued, famine might as well be modernity's symptom rather than its antithesis. Analyzing the historical causes of famines blurs the boundary between natural and man-made disasters and invites us to see ostentable misfortunes as preventable injustices. Khartoum's countryside is a perfect example of the intersection between architecture and water infrastructure that claimed to heal cycles of famine, but did exactly the opposite. If the grid was the means for colonial planning and plantation in the tropics, the veranda was its equivalent in buildings. Both MacLean and Sarsfield Hall extended their views of tropical city planning to architecture. MacLean differentiated the crowded native houses from the European ones and endorsed the veranda as the most appropriate architectural element for climatic reasons. The veranda became the most identified and designed element of colonial architecture in both residential and public buildings all across Sudan, and actually across all British colonies of the Global South. Family photographs confirm that almost every British individual occupied a single-family freestanding house in a large garden with at least one veranda. The architectural designs of these verandas varied, but they all symbolized the introduction of a new taste. Of particular note were the verandas designed by architect Gordon Brock Bridgman. They were identified with their Ionic column capitals, which used the molds initially prepared for the kiosk of King George V on his way to colonial India. Or housing for officials in Khartoum, also designed by Bridgman, was a group of buildings made up of light-colored cubes into which verandas with sloped roofs were carved. In the book, I discuss more extensively these verandas along with their carbonizing materials, use of daily life, their exquisitely landscaped and irrigated gardens in a land threatened by droughts, and their place in issues such as slavery and domestic servants, including child servants in the triangulation between British Empire, Egypt, and Sudan, or issues such as interior furnishings with animal skins, hunting trophies, and looted cultural heritage artifacts that should have been placed in museums. In the interest of time today, I will leave this to your prior knowledge and empathy. But it's hard to imagine, I think, that these families built their buildings with so permanent materials and populated their verandas and rooms with so many heavy furniture items and memory artifacts if they did not consider themselves as new settlers to stay. These houses for the European residents differed significantly and intentionally from those of the natives. The government even differentiated the residences. Improving the living conditions of the working class interested the governor even less. The master plan placed the so-called native cantonment for workers in a removed but accessible zone from the European neighborhoods. Municipal and commercial photographs only capture this housing from outside and afar as if it was an inaccessible prison or a camp. The temporary laboring population with only squatting rights here lived in single rooms without latrine facilities. Unlike the sewage system implemented for the European neighborhoods, they used earth bunkers for their defecation, and the feces were removed and buried by non-British women sweepers. The use of verandas with Ionic capitals was also a common feature for semi-public buildings. But the governor complained that the new buildings across the river in Omdurman, where the natives live, were too much like those in Khartoum, so he wished that they were more African in character. Consequently, in 1935, his office ordered designs for what they called African aesthetics and African-type buildings. Allegedly, after doing research in North Sudan, the government claimed that, quote, there was practically nothing in existence in the way of distinctive Sudanese architecture. For that reason, his office modeled their buildings on the representation of the Sudanese architecture as found in the 1931 French colonial exposition. These buildings were designed as mud brick rectangular volumes with ornamented roof lines. So curiously, the planners and architects did not consider Suakin in Sudan as a local heritage site that could have informed the climatization of the new residential typology. The town was an exceptionally memorable place due to its unique urban fabric that took its cue from the circular contour of the island and its houses built with corals taken out of the sea. It was populated with densely placed 4- or 5-story buildings adorned with exquisite extension bays and wooden mashrabia windows. Unfortunately, none of these buildings stand today. Many British officers visited and took ample photographs, but they were unwilling to learn from the distinct climate wisdom, know-how, or aesthetic sensibility of Suakin's houses. They carried the town's functions to another place, causing emigration from and trivialization of this Ottoman building culture and its eventual erasure. So in summary, it is fair to say that during the post-Ottoman British colonization of Khartoum, the dismissal of existing knowledge in relation to the rain caused flooding, the trivialization of local urban fabric in relation to the wind aggrandized the sandstorms, the racial presumptions about the impact of the sun resulted in a segregated city and the discontinuation of building culture, the misuse of the river in agricultural production failed to prevent famines, and the monocultural cotton plantation caused the loss of biodiversity. The deappreciation and trivialization of one building and farming culture with the entitlement of another is a typical example of climate agnotology in architecture. Agnotology is not simply ignorance, but the active production of non-knowledge for the interest of one group over the other. Agnotology is the conscious manufacturing of ignorance, the suppression of knowledge production, the disenfranchisement of existing wisdom. Climate agnotology in architecture here refers to the trivialization of one episteme to claim the superiority of another episteme. Blatant examples of climate agnotology up until today include the discontinuation of traditional passive cooling techniques in favor of air-conditioned climate control. Much like oil companies that conceal the indigenous people's knowledge of land, the production of desire for fossil fuel-dependent appliances and the construction methods foreclose the advancement of passive heating and cooling techniques and the use of renewable energy. Now let me shift very briefly gears to the healing part. Unfortunately, there's less to show about the healing part of the book. But still, many architects did not let these mistakes due to climate determinism go unnoticed. Soon after Sudan's independence in 1956, a cohort of citizens and foreign architects aimed to mark this transition with new planning and stylistic revisions. The most relevant for my book are those architects who were part of the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, such as Konstantinos Doxiadis, who forcibly migrated to Greece as a child during the Bulgarian-Greek population exchange, and whose father was the resettlement minister after the Greek-Turkish population swap. The Doxiadis Associates was a meeting place of architects who were descendants of the Ottoman professional networks, such as Hasan Fatih from Alexandria in today's Egypt, or Cleon Krantonalis from Kavala in today's Greece, the hometown of Ottoman Khartoum's first governor, Mehmet Ali. The Greek-speaking population, Ottoman professionals, established themselves in North Africa during his time. For instance, the Ottoman builders from the island of Karpathos in today's Greece constructed almost all of the monuments in Khartoum, and some of the Khartoum-born Greek architects, whose numbers reached 800s, designed the earliest modernist public buildings to symbolize independence after 1956. The Doxiadis Associate indeed identified the colonial grid as the main cause of problems of proper and rational land use. Among the long list of problems caused by Khartoum's previous master plans, the worst proved to be the inaugural idea of the colonial grid. Throughout his career, Doxiadis diagnosed problems of world cities as challenges brought by industrialization, but without identifying colonization as an additional historical burden on ex-colonial cities. The Doxiadis Associates' official narrative obscured colonization, but the collaborators within the office took more antagonistic tones while writing internal reports and confidential documents. Hasan Fatih, in one of these confidential documents, for instance, explicitly blamed colonization for Khartoum's waste of space and energy. He said no one has been interested in planning for human convenience, but instead in segregation. Fatih also characterized the Kitchener Master Plan as a security measure against anti-colonial resistance. As a result of these observations, the associates prepared a master plan and architectural typologies for Khartoum, which also prioritized climate in urbanism, but reached different conclusions. They foregrounded the need for new plot dimensions, courtyards, proper orientation towards the sun, ventilation created through narrow passageways or breeze, rather than colonial planners who advocated large gardens. When Sudan became independent, the nationalization of the Jazeera scheme and the redistribution of wealth to new Sudanese citizens also took priority. In this context, ex-Ottoman professional networks now working for independent Sudan identified a set of problems with land use and architectural quality that impaired the farmers' lives in the Jazeera scheme. They mapped their project area into the savanna belt and caravan routes as a visualization of the climatic and the social problems as twin pressures. They reported on the racial tensions between Arab farmers and the pilgrims, tribes and traders arriving from west of Africa, who had been sedentarized by the British colonial plantation officers. Their reports from the ground anticipated the civil wars that were around the corner for Sudan. Such documents from the ground allow us to trace the precise reason for ethnic conflict rather than blame it on essential and unbridgeable differences. Again, Hassan Fatih extended his critique of architecture and planning in Khartoum to the Jazeera plantations. He said, "Cotton has flattened the countryside and put it into uniform. As architects, we cannot propose changes in the economy of the countryside. It is therefore our duty to alleviate as far as possible the deadening effect of the economic pattern. We must try to create an environment as different as possible from that of the cotton fields." To that effect, Fatih designed an alternative unbuilt village for Jazeera. If architectural order was used to colonize cotton plantations and to dismiss the differences in the residential culture of what he called Arabs and Africans, he claimed architecture could also help build resistance and enable villagers aspire to houses and professions other than cotton farming tenants. I discovered that the Omdurman-born Sudanese, previously unknown architect Abdelmonem Mustafa is particularly fascinating. Monet Mustafa participated in, but also corrected, the tropical architecture know-how that continued to spread in architectural discourse. Rather than rejecting the use of veranda due to its colonial beginnings, he revised it among a diverse set of spaces. Inside the modular reinforced concrete frames, he altered solids and voids and designed for a whole range of open, covered, screened, and closed areas that help climate control and provide spaces for different activities. The spaces labeled in his drawings as verandas include open-air sleeping terraces for the night, shaded and socializing spaces for the day, circulation paths, living areas, and many more. Monet Mustafa noticed that the British entitlement to climate literacy was indeed quite mistaken at many fronts. Sudan's place in the field of tropical architecture was actually premised on a foundational miscategorization. The colonizers confused all their colonies as tropical lands in an overarching umbrella that spanned from Libya to Malaysia, from Saudi Arabia to Hong Kong. Monet Mustafa amended this nomenclature by identifying Khartoum as hot and dry and warning against the strong dust storms rather than tropical lands. In his own designs, he made sure the houses and campuses do not reproduce the large, wind-exposed, open-air spaces inherited from colonial planning. Instead, he grouped his buildings around courtyards and minimized uncovered walkways in a tightly knit network of buildings. He stressed the creation of a microclimate rather than large and straight avenues that were supposed to cross-ventilate the city in the misidentified tropical climate. He used some of the technical know-how that he learned as an architectural student in Britain, such as these solar diagrams and sections and so on, but in correcting the colonial expertise on climate control, it was the local know-how found in what the Orientalists dismissed as miserable, filthy, and unhealthy that guided the passive climate control in his buildings. So Monet Mustafa's architectural position, I suggest, can be regarded as climate consciousness that resists colonial inequalities of climate determinism, but does not reject international connections and modern know-how of climatization. So in the book, I discuss these early independence era projects undertaken by international and citizen architects, which were envisioned, at least for some team members, to undo the impacts of colonial era decisions. These were not problem-free projects, and they were also impacted by contradictions of post-war developmentalism, but their place in post-colonial and post-Ottoman subjectivity changed these dynamics. They survived barely for a decade due to, in part, the rise of al-Bashir's authoritarian rule, but they sought to envision an alternative to militarist planning. They tried to improve the tension between sedentary farmers and nomadic tribes. They fought against loss of biodiversity and so on. They tried, in other words, turn the conditions of precarity into an ethos of local climate wisdom that the British colonization had disrupted. Scholars usually underestimate modernist architects in newly inaugurated nation-states for not being decolonizing enough and for being helpless victims of Western developmentalism. But giving due acknowledgement to these architects require other concepts, in my opinion, such as commitment to the project translatability and to post-colonial cosmopolitanism. This position seeks for a new, more equitable international dialogue and struggles for self-determination in order to undo the domination of global empires, but not foreclose cosmopolitanism. It aims to construct the conditions for international non-domination, an egalitarian but still globally connected world order. So to conclude, in this lecture, I analyzed the history of climate determinism when climate served as a proxy for race and nation to exert power, and distinguished it from climate consciousness. At the height of the European colonial power and the age of energy transition into carbon-based technologies, architecture was mobilized to sustain the Western superpowers' industrial capitalism. The hierarchy constructed between moderate and tropical climates, North and South, Europe and colonies, white and native, impacted architecture to such an extent that cooling for white comfort became a major design goal, and thus produced the residential typology, urban morphology, and plantation logic in the European colonies. Architects and planners who worked with climate determinist categories either segregated the city along racial lines, or exerted the symbolism of order in the plantations, or employed miscalculated passive climate control techniques with misguided entitlement to climate literacy. Colonial architects were perceived as civilizing agents due to their assumed proficiency in tropical architecture that was being advanced in military offices and architecture schools. They claimed that the grid fostered thermal comfort in Khartoum, but it actually did exactly the opposite. The decision to settle on areas previously identified as flooding zones continues to distress the city to this day. The dismissal of local knowledge in microclimate making resulted in built environments that were not prepared for environmental challenges. The colonial plantation logic created controlled environments and homogenized the countryside by obliterating previous pastoral and farming habits. Focusing on Sudan, I therefore traced the cause of climate disasters to the epistemology and economy of colonial climatization, and showed the connections between colonization, carbonization, and the creation of agrarian monocultures. I also revealed implicit criticisms and alternatives formulated by early independence era figures, including architects who were descendants of the pre-colonial Ottoman professional networks. Coming back to my introduction, one of the next steps for healing from this history would be the expansion of human rights and implementation of nature's rights, and consequently, I think, climate reparations. A precondition for just energy transition is to institute an international climate debt that would restore justice retroactively to those subjugated and extracted. But this would not be a loan, as it is conceived as in mainstream developmentalist framework that puts developing countries in perpetual debt. But it would be reparations, a debt paid by the first industrializing countries to their colonies and extracted countries, so that the latter can also invest in renewable energies. So this episode, I think, shows that a country's struggle to heal from the debris of colonialism and resettler nationalism is also the world's struggle to heal from climate disasters. Thank you.
Thank you for such an interesting lecture, Professor Akcan. Now we'd like to invite Professor Akcan and Professor Zimmerman to our conversation nook for the Q&A session, for which we have roughly 20 minutes.
Questions? I think we can take questions right away from the physical audience and the virtual audience. And if there aren't any immediate questions, I will throw some out. This strikes me as, of course, different from, but also in certain ways similar to previous work of yours. I want to know more about what climate reparations looks like and whether you've dedicated much time to imagining that.
Yeah, I mean, sorry. So, climate reparations is something that's discussed in United Nations, and it is something that let's say global South countries are asking from the first industrializing nations and so on. But usually, what I think history, architectural history contributes to this discourse is to show the necessity and the justice of climate reparations, because usually the more mainstream reaction to asking for climate reparations or is, from the first global north is that why should we give this money? I mean, why should our taxpayers go and give money to some other country? But when we trace the historical injustices that was caused by first industrializing nations, I think climate reparations no longer seem as, I don't know, as a gift or as a loan, but as a debt, as something that will restore justice retroactively. So in that sense, I mean, what I'm suggesting or what I'm trying to do is to justify the need for reparations, which is already being asked by nations, and it's already a discussion in United Nations. And I think history in that sense, or architectural history or planning history, is a powerful tool in showing the need for this, or the fact that this is really a justified request. And it should not be a loan, like in usual humanitarian or developmentalist mentality, that puts the developing nations in continuous debt and liability and so on. It should not be a loan. It should be a debt that is paid to colonies.
I'm wondering, you teach in an architecture school, as do I. I see a lot of projects in the world of architectural education that go further into the idea of climate reparations by citing projects, design projects. Now, these are paper projects. These are typically not real projects, but I'm wondering if that's something you're seeing at Cornell, and also what's the potential of that to actually get architects involved in climate reparations in a more direct way than simply through payment schemes.
I think climate consciousness is the middle term that I use. I mean, there's a lot of climate determinism still lingering on. Some of the stereotypes are still lingering on. So replacing climate determinism with climate consciousness is something that I think translates into architectural form very directly and very easily, because all these passive climate control techniques or low carbon space making techniques and so on, these are all building climate consciousness. So in that sense, I think for architectural discourse, or for the architects, I see climate consciousness as a more, let's say, appropriate part of this framework. Or being climate conscious would bring reparations. You can also discuss it like that.
Hi, Esra. Thank you for the wonderful lecture. And it was so immense research. I counted the archive. There are more than 5 and numerous sources. So it's very intense and wonderful. We learned a lot. I had only one question with the term nationalism, because in your book, the title is Resettler Nationalism. Is that something you mean by post-colonial nationalism? Because when you talk about the displacement, when you talk about the migration, it's in many cases, it's a small number or a small geographic area in a country. Let's say South Asia or even in Turkey, right? Multiple groups came. So how does it form nationalism? In short, the use of the term nationalism was little unclear for me. If you could elaborate, please.
So I don't use the word nationalism alone. It's resettler nationalism. So it is basically the map that I showed, which showed like 5 million Muslims and 2 million Christians being displaced and sent to new towns. So there was this whole, and then I made a list of events. There were these old treaties and diplomatically enforced population transfers that basically, like Trump is offering now in Gaza, that basically dispossessed large communities and resettled them in new locations, which were not appropriate, where they didn't speak the language and so on. All this was done in order to divide the world into nation states. So that's what I call resettler nationalism, or I think the word, or I offer the term resettler nationalism as a more explanatory concept to come to terms with this project, which happened in India-Pakistan partition as well, but it also happened a lot during the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire into the current world order. So dispossessing large communities and resettling them, dividing them based on their assumed races and religions and so on, is what I name as resettler nationalism. And it was, from the viewpoint of the diplomats, it was considered a solution to ethnic conflict. But what I'm saying is that it was not a solution to ethnic conflict. It was actually the trauma that was imposed on these communities, which eventually unmixed the populations, and it created the border that is still today the European Union versus non-European Union border. So these historical events throughout the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire created a new world order that divided Asia, Africa, and Europe into three continents, and partitioned this land into several nation states by dispossessing, and resettling the communities.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question is in regards to your book or publication, Architecture and Translation. In this book, you pointed out that the world's urban population has outnumbered the rural, and in a sense that informal settlements have caused people within those settlements who aren't in, I guess, the modern urban space to be rejected from a perceived social contract. So the way I interpret that, I suppose, is if you're in a more, if you're in a out in the outskirts of like a major city, or if you're just not in the place where you have access to a lot of convenient resources, you, by the law of the social contract, you're a bit like outcast a bit. So my question relates to this, and I'm wondering, how do we identify this kind of urban population takeover compared to the outskirts? How do we identify this as it's happening? For example, like in gentrification, the way I understand it, how do we see it as it's happening? And is it worth it to try to mitigate it or to intervene, or is it just something that is destined to happen that we should just let happen? Because there are a lot of places that are still going through this process of, let's just call it gentrification.
Yeah, in a way, informal settlements and gentrification are, I think, two very different phenomena. I mean, both are happening, but for different communities. So in terms of the informal settlement, and the word informal is, it's to be debated. Some scholars would say it's better and more honest to call it slums, to expose the capitalist urbanization and so on. So that is, in a way, the urbanization mode for many countries in the world, especially the global south. So I mean, it is happening because of the inequality between, the income levels of the population that is migrating from rural to urban lands. So intervening is not maybe a nice word, but trying to prevent it by giving dues and by distributing resources more evenly is definitely what I think a more just and more equitable urban planning would do. That doesn't mean to intervene in the sense that it has been done in the book that I'm talking about, meaning the state coming and destroying the houses of the immigrants and then making them homeless. And that's not what I mean by, obviously that's not a good intervention, but trying to distribute the resources more evenly so that the population, the migrating population is not, do not have to live in substandard units that are not given enough urban functions and sanitation and so on, is definitely, I think, what planners with, social justice ethics would do, would try to do. You're welcome.
Thank you for your very compelling and eloquent dissection of, resettlement architecture as a form of racist segregation. I actually would like to know, because given the fact that it's not classical in that sense, the genesis for how you went about, well, whether there was a triggering event and how you went about searching for the narratives and the pictures, right, of the people who got displaced and resettled.
Whether there was a triggering event for me personally, or
Yeah, and also like how you actually went about assembling the information, right? And getting the narratives from the displaced settlers or resettled, and the architecture that came with it, right? Because it's not like they're all sitting around waiting for you to come and give that. So I'd like to also find out a little bit about the process that you undertook to collate all of the information. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's a very long story, but in a way, as a historian, I of course do archival work. So the book brings together documents from many archives, including colonial archives, national archives, and archives of city archives, village archives, and so on. But it also realizes that archival the documents that survived in the archives are not going to tell us the story from the viewpoint of the victims, from the viewpoint of those who were most affected. So for that reason, I was trying to raise what I call this people's history of architecture, like the voice from bottom up. And that happens in oral history in some cases, but obviously I'm looking at a time that is far earlier than oral history can encompass. So memoirs of people, family photographs, the ethnographic work done with those migrants at the time. So all those were documents, if you want to name it that way, that I used to raise this voice from below. So a lot of family photographs, a lot of oral histories done at that time, and going to the actual places, the abandoned cities, abandoned towns, and so on. So it's a very big mixture of of places that allowed me to bring the story together. Triggering event. Well, I mean, in a way, this would be totally unrelated because I didn't tell it today, but I started this book by looking at Saturday mothers in Istanbul who have been organizing a sit-in since 1995, so it has been 30 years. So they are, it's a human rights movement that is against enforced disappearance. So the mothers whose daughters and sons have been taken to police custody and never came back. Basically, they were tortured and dead. So that was the first, let's say, thing that captured my mind in order to understand the healing of an individual mother. But yeah, I don't know if that's a trigger, but there were multiple triggers. I mean, for obviously resettler nationalism, Greek-Turkish exchange of populations was a triggering event, climate disaster. So there were multiple triggers, not one trigger. I mean, the world is full of triggers. Every day there is a disaster or a conflict that we hear in the news. So I wouldn't say one trigger. It's like a constant, like storms of triggers that come at me. Yeah. You're welcome.
We have time for probably two more questions.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for your lecture. I learned a lot and I'm looking forward to the book. I think for me, I'm kind of curious, how do you see the role of landscape architecture fitting into the process of healing spatially? So I'm kind of curious on that angle as somebody from the landscape architecture field. So,
yeah. For instance, the chapter on extinction and healing from the loss of biodiversity definitely involves landscape architecture or the areas of like the design of gardens, parks, and not the design, but the emergence of ruderal spaces, urban natures is a concept that I look at. So definitely in discussing extinction, how the species, whether species that are planted by landscape architects or that emerge in cities unexpectedly or in an unwelcome manner. So these are the, landscape architecture as a discipline comes in a lot while talking about biodiversity in cities. And I definitely look at some, radical conservation movements that have emerged in the past and trace their beginnings or similar ideas to ideas in around this time in the 1970s and so on. So I look at architects' collaboration with biologists and so on in trying to propose projects that will, in their mind, prevent extinction and increase biodiversity. So there's definitely a lot to collaborate between architecture and landscape architecture when we are dealing with the loss of biodiversity and mass extinction. So that comes into the book in the last chapter.
Last question.
In your when you were talking about Khartoum and the Doxiadis master plan, one of the drawings that you showed seemed to have some kind of income-based zoning. So there were shading for high income, middle income, low income.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit? That sort of fascinating detail.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it is quite common to divide the city based on income, and Doxiadis that was definitely guilty of that. So, I mean, in today's talk, I was trying to show the collaborators in the office who were, writing these confidential reports and blaming colonization for the problems and so on. But in their own plans, they did not necessarily, or did not, I mean, Doxiadis associates the plans that come out of their office kind of divided the city into income zones. So they were not at all social justice oriented in that sense, yeah. Yeah, thank you, because that allows me to also remind that, like the like healing also, or manipulations in the name of healing also come with a lot of problemful projects.
Esra, thank you so much. I think it's time for me to hand back to Sally to close out the
Thank you.
day.
This concludes tonight's lecture. Thank you all for the thoughtful questions. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you that we have one more endowed lecture coming up this term. It will be the 2025 Priestley Lecture in the History of Ideas, and we will have those from March 18th to 20th with all the lectures at 4 p.m. The speaker will be Professor Sanjay Subramaniam. He's the Distinguished Professor and Irving and Jean Stone Endowed Chair in Social Sciences in the Meyer and Renee Luskin Department of History at the University of California in Los Angeles. His title is Philology, Botany, and Religion, Euro-Asian Intellectual Encounters in the 17th Century. So we continue to have exciting and diverse talks by interesting people. The UC Endowed Lectures are a fantastic opportunity to hear from renowned lecturers talking about the things that they are most passionate about. I encourage you to attend, and I hope I will see some of you there. I'd like to extend special thanks to Professor Claire Zimmerman for being our convener and moderator tonight, and for Amin Ahmed at the back of the room there for acting as our virtual facilitator, all the students, staff, and faculty involved in the planning of Professor Akcan's visit, Bonnie Huang for running the technology to allow this hybrid event to take place. But especially you, Esra, thank you for your inspiring talk. No doubt your perspective on architecture will reverberate in our minds and maybe give us a new awareness of the spaces we walk around and the structures we have in our midst around Toronto and beyond. For those of you who are here in person, it's now time to retire to our senior common room just next door. Please stay and enjoy some food and drink with us. Thank you for being here.